exciting. Maybe. All right, let's pray. Is there anything that anyone would like me to pray for specifically this morning? Cool. That's fine.
It's good to have Jock back with us.
Yes. Hi, Jock. All right. Well, let's pray together before we talk. All right. Dear Jesus, thank you for the Bible. Thank you for the Bible. Thank you for these stories that we find there that, kind of the tried and true stories that remind us of our true north, that remind us of you and who you are and the things that you do. So thank you for being faithful and trustworthy. Thank you for giving reasons for us to trust you. And thank you that we get to know you and that you have made it possible for us to learn about you and who you are. Thank you for that. And I thank you this morning for this church, that we can come together in this building and in person safely, and that we can hear about you and grow together. Thank you for the wider church, for all the other believers in the world that may be gathering right now or maybe wishing that they could gather today. So I pray that you would be with them and that you would unify us today by your Spirit. I thank you for, I do thank you for coronavirus. Not necessarily for the virus, but I thank you for the way that you will work through this. And I thank you for the things that you're teaching us in it. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us to figure out a vaccine or some kind of way of preventing this virus so that life can, go back to some kind of normal. But I do thank you, Lord, for the lessons that you're teaching us. And I pray that if anyone here is worried or is anxious about anything to do with that you would give them peace and that you would remind them that, like you were with Daniel in the lion's den, you're with us right now and always. And I thank you for Jock, and I thank you for being with him, and thank you for his help today, Lord. And I pray that you would continue to help him and be with him and let him know that you're with him. And I pray right now for Pastor Don, who was just on vacation, and for Tracy, and I pray that that was a restful time, that you would show him today that he is loved and appreciated by his congregation, and I thank you for his leadership here. And I pray for Tracy, now that school is done, that she would find lots of rest this summer and get to do things that she loves doing. So I pray, Lord, this morning that you would be here in this room, that you would be working in our hearts, that you'd be working in my heart and in the heart of those in this room and those watching online, that you would teach us something today, that you would convict us if that's what you'd like to do, that you would comfort us if that's what you'd like to do, but that you would work, and we ask you for that, and we thank you for that. So, dear Jesus, we pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. Well, yes, I'm preaching, so that's exciting. So, today we're going to talk about humility, although, frankly, I could probably tell you a lot more about pride, personally. I know a lot more about that. One of my friends this past year said that unless you're really ready for God to answer your request, you should not ask him to humble you, because he will do it. And I can tell you that that is the truth. He will do it. I learned that this year for sure. And I used to think that I was a pretty humble person. Like someone gives me a compliment and I'm like, oh, thank you, right? Like I'm a humble person. But, I actually have learned that it kind of sneaks in easily sometimes, pride. It's kind of like when you pick a flower and there's like a little vine wrapped around the flower. That's kind of like what pride is like in my heart. It sneaks in around the good things like love and joy and peace. It sneaks in around that really subtly and wraps its way up, and it can, suck the nutrients out of the good things. It can kind of choke out the good things in my life and make it difficult to bear any good fruit before I even notice, really. And I think that's kind of the way it works in a lot of our used to get in arguments a lot with one of my teachers. And he was an atheist, which that's fine. He was not quiet about it. He obviously had some issues with the church and with religion and spirituality in general, and that's, that's fine. He had some legitimate concerns, but I was not a quiet Christian, so I liked to argue with him about it. Now, I was not in a place, mentally or spiritually, where I could have any fruitful arguments with him, but I liked to be right, and I liked to argue, so I tried to argue with him. So, yeah, one time he was explaining to us that instead of using the terms AD or BC to describe a year, so instead of like Anno Domini and before Christ, we use, as historians, we're supposed to use Common Era and before Common Era. And, he talked about this, and he gave some legitimate reasons for it, probably, looking back, but I, wanted to argue with him and say, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's still based on God, it doesn't matter what you're calling it. So I was, I argued with him for quite a while about that, probably 5 or 10 minutes in the middle of class. And, it wasn't, nothing really came of it. We just, I didn't win the argument, but I also felt, haha, I just argued with the teacher. And so I went home, and my classmates always enjoyed that. They always got a kick out of it. But anyway, I went home and I told my parents, guess what I did today? I got in an argument with my teacher about Common Era, and my dad said, why would you argue with him about that? Because that's what historians use. Those are the terms that they use. They don't use AD and BC. They use Common Era. And so I was pretty embarrassed. And looking back, that embarrassment was me being humbled. It was my dad saying to me, you're wrong, you just argued with your teacher, disrespected your teacher, and you were wrong. And that was embarrassing. Now, usually when we read the Bible, we tend to align ourselves with the good guys, right? So when we're reading the story of the Israelites and the Egyptians, we like to read it and say that we're the Israelites rather than the Egyptians, right? We want to align ourselves with the people that we think are good. But when I read the book of Daniel, I seem to have a lot less in common with Daniel than I do with King Nebuchadnezzar. So you'll notice that we don't really have a set scripture today. We're kind of just going to talk through some of the characters in Daniel. But King Nebuchadnezzar is known most famously, I think, for building that really huge statue. And so I am going to read that story. It's in Daniel 3, the first 15 verses there. And I'm going to do a little paraphrasing because there's a lot of lists. But anyway, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, and it was huge. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned a ton of important people to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So all these people came, and they were at the dedication for this huge image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So that's pretty serious. So therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the music playing must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the music playing, If you're ready to fall down and worship, good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So the story goes on, and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they refuse to worship it, and they get thrown into the furnace, and God saves them. But I think that this morning, one of the important parts for us in terms of pride is that in building this huge statue, it wasn't of him himself, but he built a huge statue, and in controlling who and when people worship, King Nebuchadnezzar is trying to make himself into a god. He's treating himself like he is God. I love what he says in verse 15, "And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Because he actually thinks that he's better than the gods that he worships himself. He actually thinks that he is more powerful than the gods that he is trying to honor. So he really thinks that he is a god himself. What King Nebuchadnezzar is demonstrating for us today is that pride essentially is treating yourself as though you are a god. And that's obviously not to say that we build statues and make people worship them. But for us, it can look a lot more subtle. It can look like me, right? Always trying to be right, trying to impress my classmates with my intelligence. It can be being unwilling to listen to others. It can look like being in a grocery store and yelling at a 16-year-old employee that you have to pay to use plastic bags now. It can look like getting mad at a family member for not having a meal cooked when you come home. In any of these situations, and in many more, we make the world focus on us as though we are God and we deserve that care and focus. And it's prideful. So while the king of Babylon he's the literal manifestation of what it means to be prideful, Daniel is the complete opposite of the king. So Daniel is a little bit of a peaceful protester. So Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, he has once again taken over Judah, which is the important part of Israel, because that's where Jesus comes from. And this time he's destroyed Jerusalem and ransacked the temple. And along with that, he is trying to assimilate some of the young Jewish men into the Babylonian culture. So he gives them new names. Like, did you know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego isn't their real names? Those are their Babylonian names, but they're much easier to say. So yeah, he gives them new names. He invites them to come to live in the palace and get trained for new jobs. And he gives them the best food, the best wine, so they have a really good life, basically, is what the king is offering to them. And all of the men, they go and they're really excited, except for Daniel. He knows that he serves God and not King Nebuchadnezzar. So when King Nebuchadnezzar offers all this food and all these things, Daniel refuses it. See, Daniel knows that the Babylonians don't serve the God of Israel. They worship idols. So that means that a lot of their food and their wine would have been dedicated to idols rather than being prepared in the way that the Jewish law required or in the name of the one true God. So for Daniel to have eaten it would have been going against what the standards that God has set for the Israelites. So he's a wise person. He knows that the food doesn't match up to the standards. So he asks the person who's supervising him, "Would you mind just serving me and my 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, just fruit, vegetables, and water?" Because he knows that way there's no chance of him becoming unclean by eating the bad food. Now, immediately when he asks this, the supervisor says, "No, I'm too afraid of what the king would do to me if you don't look as healthy as all the other young men." But Daniel knows that he is serving the King of Kings, and he trusts enough in the laws of God and in the Lord himself that he still asks, regardless of the potential ramifications. Daniel is humble enough to trust God. See, the difference between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel is that while King Nebuchadnezzar treats himself as though he is a god, Daniel acts in humility when he acknowledges that the ways and commands of the God of Israel are trustworthy. That God is who he says he is and that he'll do what he says that he'll do. Humility means trusting in God, even if it might be scary, even if it doesn't totally make sense. It means recognizing that he is God and you are not God. King Nebuchadnezzar didn't get that, obviously, because he was trying to become God. He was trying to be the person that he wanted people to submit to trust. But Daniel knew that to be humble means you trust God. So, like I said, Daniel is a bit of a protester. So he didn't want to eat the food that the king was offering, and he asked his supervisor to put him on this alternate diet. But you know what I really appreciate about Daniel is the way that he asks the supervisor for this new diet. When the supervisor says that he's scared, Daniel doesn't, make a fool of him. He doesn't get angry at the supervisor. He's not a jerk about it. He doesn't say, how dare you not allow me to eat this food because this is my religion and I have a right to it. He doesn't insult the supervisor. Daniel sees that the supervisor is scared, right? He recognizes that the supervisor has fears here, and they're legitimate fears. And so he doesn't, get mad about it. He's not a big, arrogant jerk about it. He says, okay, I recognize that you are scared of your king. Let's try it. Let me just try out the diet, and if it doesn't work, then I'll do what you want me to do. See, the way that Daniel interacts with this man is respectful and gracious and humble. He's not mean about it. He's kind. He acknowledges that this man is a fellow human being, so he's nice to him. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, on the other hand, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down and worship, King Nebuchadnezzar was a little bit rude about it, I think. So in Daniel chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, he says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the music playing, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. So it's kind of like he thinks that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are too stupid to get it the first time. Like the reason they didn't bow down is that they weren't all up there, right? They didn't get it. So he repeats it to them. And that's why I kind of talked a little slow, right? It's like he's explaining it to little kids. It's really condescending, right? He's not treating them as if they are fellow humans. He's treating them as though he is a god and they are just little humans that he needs to come down to his level and explain this to. He's not being kind or gracious or humble. He speaks down to them. And on the surface, it might seem like he's treating them with kindness and respect, but if you really did a heart check, if you really looked inward and thought about it, I think that he would more honestly say that he's put himself on a pedestal. And the reason I feel like I can say that is because I've done it myself. Remember when I was telling you about my teacher and how I called him out on some pretty insignificant detail and disrespected him in front of the whole class? And if I really thought about it, that wasn't because I was trying to be loving to him or trying to tell him that God loves him or trying to serve him well. I thought that I was better than him. I thought that I was smarter than him, that I knew more than him, that I was holier than him, right? I put myself on this pedestal, and I thought that he was not as good as me, basically. And that's an ugly truth, and that's an embarrassing thing to say, which kind of shows me that I still have pride in my heart, but it's an ugly thing. Pride is an ugly thing. And I think that if we are honest as Christians, I think a lot of you would probably be able to think of a situation similar to mine, right? As Christians, we do tend to build ourselves up in our minds and get this holier-than-thou kind of mindset, where we're looking down on other people, causing us to treat other people, even other Christians, as though they are not as good as we are, as though we are holier than them. Now, it's one thing to be proud of God, right? So Daniel was proud of God when he followed God's rules. He took pride in living as someone who follows God, and that's good. That's a good thing. But living as someone who serves God and treats other people poorly, like they are less than, is not actually a sign of someone who legitimately is trying to serve God. That's more a sign of someone who's trying to serve themselves. Like in that classroom, calling him out. I was trying to make myself look good in front of my classmates. I wasn't trying to serve God or serve my teacher. So Daniel can teach us a lot about what it means to be humble. He teaches us that being humble means trusting God, that being humble means that we treat other people well, with respect and dignity, not with this holier-than-thou kind of attitude. And Daniel also teaches us that being humble means that serving God is your number one priority. I think it's important to mention that from the very beginning of Daniel onward, Daniel's gaining more and more power and more respect within the Babylonian Empire. He becomes well known, he's wise, people like him generally. Like in the story that Shannon just read, the lion's den, the king actually was really sad that he had to throw Daniel into the lion's den because he really liked Daniel. So there are so many times in the book of Daniel when he could have used his gifts and his power to his own advantage. But he doesn't. In Daniel chapter 5, King Nebuchadnezzar's son, King Belshazzar, has a very frightening experience that you'll just have to read about on your own. And he needs someone to interpret some things for him. And Daniel's really good at interpreting things, but King Belshazzar kind of forgot about Daniel. So he calls for all the magicians, the sorcerers, all the wise people of Babylon to come to his palace and interpret these things for him. And if they do, then the king will give them the third highest power in Babylon. But not one of these people can do it. Not one of these people is able to give the king the right interpretation. And so someone reminds King Belshazzar of Daniel, and Daniel comes in, and King Belshazzar says, okay, if you can tell me what this means, then you will be given the third highest position in my kingdom. But Daniel says, in chapter 5, verse 17, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. And sure enough, he goes on and gives the exact interpretation to the king. In giving this interpretation, Daniel knew in his heart that he wasn't serving King Belshazzar with that. Daniel knew that this interpretation and the message that he had to give wasn't so that he could get the third highest power or position in Babylon. It was because he had an obligation to the Lord to give the interpretation to King Belshazzar. He didn't need King Belshazzar's power, he didn't need his gifts or his praise. He was serving God. He wasn't serving Daniel's own best interests. He wasn't serving, his desires to get higher up in the kingdom. He was serving God. So like we learned from King Nebuchadnezzar, pride is treating yourself as though you are a god. It's putting yourself first. It's adopting that holier-than-thou approach to life. But see, in acting in that way, it's a direct conflict with your ability to serve God well. Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, you can't serve two masters. You can't be trying to serve yourself and put yourself on top and put yourself on a pedestal and, not trust God, and as well as serving God. You can't do both of those things at the same time. It's just not going to work. That day I argued with my teacher. If I had done a heart check, if I really examined my motives, I would have realized that by calling him out like that, I wasn't serving God, I was serving myself. I was trying to make him look stupid and me look smart. And none of those things are about serving God. Putting yourself up on a pedestal is not about serving God. But Daniel didn't do that. He didn't look out for his own interests or serve himself first. He wasn't concerned with the power that the Babylonian kings were offering him. He wasn't concerned in putting himself up on a pedestal. Daniel, through it all, was serving God. He wanted to do whatever it was that God asked of him. He was humble before God. He was God's servant. He trusted God. Being humble, according to Daniel, means that you treat other people well. It means that above all, you serve God. Being humble means trusting that God is who he says that he is. It means treating other people with dignity and respect, not with this holier-than-thou outlook, but as equals, as other human beings under God. Being humble means not looking out for yourself, but serving God above all, because he's worth it. He's worth your trust. He's worth using your talents and your gifts on. He's the only thing that is of any true value. He allows you and he invites you to trust him, to rely on him, to be humble before him, as he shows you grace and love and kindness. He's worth your humility. He's more important than making myself look smart, than making sure other people know that I'm a good Christian. He's worth all my trust, all my strength, all my mind, my heart, my soul, all my life. He's worth it all, and don't let your pride get in the way of that. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for your grace, and thank you that we can be humble before you, and that you allow that. You allow us to come before your throne and bow before you and know that you are God and we are not. That takes a lot of the pressure off of us. So thank you, Lord, for who you are and what you do. In your name we pray. Amen.